Aloha, everybody. Welcome back to the Wall Street Coach podcast. My name is Kim Ann Curtin, and I am the Wall Street Coach. I'm very excited today to have Brian Lee, who's been on this podcast at least one or two other times. Brian, thank you for coming back on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kim.
It's always great to talk to you, Brian. I feel so much of your wisdom and your contributions to the trading community is, it knows no bounds. You're just always trying to assist other traders on their journey. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit today about risk and how often it is misunderstood, not just by beginner traders, but also, I would say, sophisticated traders based on conversations I've had with them. I think this is such an overlooked piece of the puzzle, and you are one of the few who consistently speak to it, which is why I wanted to have you on this podcast today. So thank you for agreeing. I want to thank our sponsor, Centerpoint, for sponsoring the Wall Street Coach podcast. And if you're ready to experience 60 days commission-free and their exceptional customer service, then please use our link to check them out. Now back to our podcast.
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's so many misconceptions. The first thing is that you have to risk a lot to make a lot, and that if you're on a roll, that it's never going to end. The risk is always there, actually, no matter if you're, like myself, you're 8 years in your career, or if you're a beginner, or if you're even like a veteran, 20 plus years in your career, you can always give it all back. And the reason why is because, let's just say you made $1 million, right? In trading, we tend to risk percentages of our account. So let's say that you risk like 10% of your account and you just happen to lose like 2 or 3 times. Now you're down 30% of your account. So take that million, shave off 30%. And if you know anything about trading, and maybe you don't, basically, like, as you draw down, the deeper and deeper you go percentage-wise, the more difficult it is to recuperate. And this is a concept called geometric returns and geometric losses. So they factor in like how percentages actually dictate your success as a trader. And what a lot of traders don't understand at the beginner level is like how sensitive risk is. So say, for example, like I always try to tell people like 1% of your account is really reliable. It's almost like the Goldilocks. It's never let me down, and it's neither too aggressive nor too defensive. Like you're kind of just risking enough. And what traders tend to do is they feel it's too small, and they don't understand how gradually compounding those gains really adds up. And therefore they try to do those things where they go like, let's risk 10% of my account. Let's risk 15% of my account in this trade because it's a so-called like S tier or A plus trade or something like this. And it's not like every single trade you take is a winner. I mean, like at the end of the day, it's all probability. So even if you have like 75% chance to win, right? There's still that 25% chance you don't. And how do you even quantify those odds anyway? Regardless, most trading strategies are not just one and done. It's not like you just put in that 10% risk and that's it. Most of the times, the amount of risk you put on is congruent or directly correlated with how much you're going to make. So say, for example, if you expect to make 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 on your trade, it makes most sense to actually risk at least 2 tries or 3 tries with that intended risk. And if you ever vary from that percentage you pick at the start, it's actually going to make a big difference towards the result. So say, for example, if you risk 10% and your A plus trade didn't work out, and you're like, I don't feel confident anymore, I'm going to risk 5%. Well, it's going to take twice as big of a win to even just go to break even, right? You kind of have to commit to the bid. That's what I call it. I say, if you go in with a certain like strategy, or you have a certain position sizing algorithm, some people might call it, basically you have to stick with it. Otherwise, it's just not going to pan out in the end. You're always consistently going to be flipping around, having bigger winners than you have losers. or you're gonna occasionally take big wins that wipe out tons of, or you're gonna have big losses, sorry, that wipe out tons of wins of the past. And the thing is that, again, like it doesn't matter. You rack up 10 wins. If you decide, hey, one day I'm just going to give it outsized amount of size, you can lose pretty much all that and more. And it's going to take you double the effort, if not triple, to make it back. So what people don't realize is there's this consistency factor. And at the end of the day, I find even professionals make this mistake, is like forgetting, and I can see why this happens when you're kind of in a groove, forgetting that the only thing you can control is risk. Like you have to kind of map out your worst case scenarios. And let's just say, for example, you are willing to put on that 5 or 10% risk. Assume that you lost maybe 2 or 3 times in a row. And if you can't handle that loss, like that 15 or 20% or 30% drawdown on one single trade, then you're very much outsized on your risk. So that's kind of like the basis of it in a nutshell, but there's like a lot to go in there for that.
Yeah. Would you be willing to share how far into your journey you were present to the critical importance of managing your risk? Is that something you believe that you saw earlier than some of your peers?
I think so. It's a little bit of luck, but I definitely was searching for education like a lot of people do. So pretty much as soon as I realized I wasn't gonna actually make it as a trader if I just kept winging it,
Mhm.
I sought sources of information, and I paid for education, which ended up kind of being a scam, but at the end of the day, they ripped the information from another course. So I still got somewhat legitimate information.
Yeah.
And the way I see it is, as long as the information somewhat resonates with you, like it makes sense, you understand it, and it feels right, I think you should give it a try. For me, one of the first things I just landed on was risk and using R and things like this. And it's so fundamental and it's so core to trading and so universally applicable that like even to this day I get people messaging me from like all different types of markets, like they trade options, which I literally couldn't tell you anything about, um, telling me how they're using R and how they're putting these concepts into like actual practice, and like it's working for them. And so I see that across different assets, futures traders, whatever. I usually just trade small caps, but basically it's so universally approachable and understandable because at the end of the day, it's just money management to its core. Everything is to its like, if you people want to always talk about dollar amounts, but you never get an insight into how much they risked in order to make that much money. And so they could have risked $50,000 to make $30,000. It doesn't mean that's a bad trade,
Mhm.
but it's not nearly as impressive as someone making 30K with a $5,000 risk, or even like much smaller amount of risk. Those multiples really are the core of trading.
Mhm. I also don't see those traders who perhaps, not in a negative way, but are, bragging about their success. Infrequently will they articulate what risk they did take. And that I do think does a disservice to all traders, but especially the more new traders, because they aren't able to, they're comparing themselves against information that isn't complete.
Yeah, you just, after all this time, the only thing I've understood is you can only control how much you lose. And thinking of the worst case scenario and just like understanding what that actually means for your account and how you're going to have to navigate your way out of that situation is completely up to you. I've advised plenty of traders who are just coming in. Like I've talked with a bunch of gamers who were interested in trading, and they've kind of asked me for guidance, and I've said like, "Hey, look, you're new. you can lose however much you want to lose to learn how to trade. It's your tuition. It's not like you're going to Harvard or something where you have to pay up. You can lose 1/10 or 1/20th of what someone else would pay to learn that information. So just go small. And I don't know what it is, but I think just human nature is people tend to go for those big risks because they don't understand like how can I make progress if I'm not putting on large risk, but at the heart of trading as well is something called tail risk.
Mhm.
And so you'll see a lot of traders, they'll make these huge wins and make everyone have a ton of FOMO. And the reality is like it could work for them 90% of the time, but 1 out of 10 trades, they'll blow up their entire account. And like I said, if you lose a small amount of percentage of your account in terms of drawdown, it's not going to make a big difference. But when you start getting to that 30, 40, 50% range and plus, the amount you need to recover it is exponential. And the thing is, like, when traders tend to go into slumps, they're not always thinking objectively either. And
Mhm.
you might not think objectively when you take a big loss, and you might force the issue as well. So, like, on a purely numerical basis, you're at a huge disadvantage when you let that happen. But also, you have to factor in the human element, which I think people never really like consider. And I always kind of do because I know mistakes are just part of it, no matter how far you go. And I've seen even like algorithms make mistakes as well.
Speak more about the algorithms making mistakes.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, there's likely a human that's engineering the algorithm, and you're also basing your data on old sample sets as well. Markets can change. So say, for example, there's a lot of traders who really want to gather as much information as possible, and they want to make it so black and white in the sense of like, okay, let me gather the last 20 years of small caps data. But the thing is, like, if you were here but before 2020 and you were trading, you would know that there was a huge influx of volume. There's also a huge influx of new traders as well that have drastically changed the market.
Mm.
Um, Algorithms themselves, like competing against yourself, they pick up basically tricks and they understand how to manipulate and create novel situations. For example, one of the most ridiculous scenarios was this stock called ZJYL, which was a well-known like liquidation name. Basically, what it would do, they would just pump and dump it, but it would be a huge fade essentially, and people like to capitalize on that. And essentially, they had an whoever was engineering this trade figured out how to manipulate a market mechanic called a halt, and they literally blew out so many traders. I've seen just hundred, like I at least personally, I know
Mhm.
dozens of traders who've lost pretty much their entire account, will have to reset. And up until that point, I don't. I mean, I'm sure that's happened before,
Mhm.
before, but for me, that was like something that was kind of impossible to imagine. And so when you kind of like want to assume that you know everything or that you're trying to gather all this information, it doesn't really line up with the reality. And that's why one of the core principles of like the way that I trade is that I track the cycle that the market is in.
Mm.
And that changes a lot of things for me because based on how the psychology of the market is or how other traders are feeling even,
Mm.
and I can tell as well because I'm in constant communication with other traders. Like I like to help, I like to be answering questions, stuff like that. So I know like if I'm having a bad day, I'll be like, okay, someone's probably having a massively bad day because I'm trying my best to keep it together. Right. So those are the times usually that I'll reach out or I'll like make it known like, hey, this is tough.
Mhm.
Don't give up.
Mhm.
And that it'll get better. But I think what happens is when people go so black and white, they don't understand the changes and like the ebbs and flows. And that's where people tend to give up and like just basically throw everything away.
I want to thank our sponsor, Centerpoint. That is the trading platform where active traders thrive. And if you let them know you're coming from the Wall Street Coach, we're putting a link right here just for you. You'll get a 60-day commission-free experience with them. You are also going to get exceptional customer service. I look forward to hearing how much you guys love them. Now back to our podcast. I really heard you say at the start of the conversation that, at least for those that are the new traders, but I think this applies probably to the vets as well. If there is this desire to create more for their account, and that feeling of impatience takes hold of them, I presume that that is when they will, perhaps go and take this incredible risk that isn't advisable. So what else besides, let's say, I guess we could call that FOMO, but I think it's also perhaps unreasonably high expectations, not just of themselves, but of what trading is.
Yeah. Trading is almost like this game that I mean, I came in and perceive it almost like competition.
Mhm.
And it's true that we do fight for resources and things like that, but at the end of the day, what I've noticed the most is that the traders themselves are kind of their own demise.
Mm.
Um, I like to think of myself and other traders as well who are really risk forward. They're just kind of like cockroaches, like they survived a nuclear war that comes every once in a while, and you just survive, and through surviving you make it. But what I find is like when you try to live up essentially to some experience that you had in the past, and it becomes way more damaging if you've done something wrong, for example. So let's say like you achieve some level of success, but you did it by breaking some rules or by oversizing a trade, and now all of a sudden you have to live up to some sort of high peak that was naturally out of your own, like I don't want to say limitations, but you kind of pushed yourself further than you should have, and you just got away with it. And that's one thing that happens for sure, and people constantly chase that feeling, and that is super destructive. And honestly, I don't exactly know the best way to deal with that. The only thing I've seen in those situations is that people just get humbled. Um, Sadly, a lot of times you have to take a big loss to learn from that, or at least that's what I've noticed.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you've had good times, I mean, say for example, the easiest thing to mention is just COVID. So a lot of traders had a very good 2021, 2020, like myself, and I found myself always constantly comparing, like, I used to be there, or I used to trade like that, or I used to do really well, and I want to get back to that level where I want to be there. But what I realized in thinking that way was just kind of like a year of going back and forth, just bouncing around. And when I personally just kind of let go and just said, you know what, I don't care. It's a business. I'll pull money out. I'm totally fine. And I'll just take whatever the market gives me. Then that changed a lot, and actually was pretty much the biggest like resurgence I've had, or at least the biggest rebound I've had personally, just emotionally and in my trading as well. And I feel like that letting go, I don't know, depending on how stubborn you are, like I'm very stubborn, so it took me a long time, but depending on how stubborn you are, letting go is usually the easiest way to get back on track. Because if you're constantly attached to that thing that you're chasing, then it's a pretty miserable journey where you're not even really happy with what you have or anything.
No doubt about it. Such a powerful point to make that. And also, I think it'll just lend oneself to choices that aren't even in the best interest of what it is that they're truly seeking, right? It'll take them even longer because they're not flowing with what the market is delivering. It's like, I don't like that. Well, there's times the market's going to deliver things you don't like.
No, seriously, even when there's something you think you do like even when you think everything is lined up for you, I've noticed that the disappointment of those situations is so very frequent.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you realize time and time again, it's if shit hits the fan, and it will, like, what is the result going to be? Like, do you know how much risk you actually have at play? And
But
the like every single time that I felt, oh, this is the time to push it or something like that, I've pretty much always regretted it. And I've never once regretted taking money out of the account, and especially on a hot streak. So that's one thing that I've adapted to as well. A lot of people, they want to just run and gun as soon as they start getting any momentum whatsoever. And they don't understand that that momentum usually ends in a car crash. And every single time that I wire out on hot streaks, like, it feels wrong. It feels like, no, your ego like tells you, hey, if you want to size up, you want to get bigger, you want to go to bigger and better places, like, this is what you got to do. You just got to put it all on the line again. But what I realize is, like, it doesn't play out as nicely as your imagination. And like when you wire out on a hot streak and you lose, it's so much less damaging. So while you're kind of like, I mean, mentally you're just chilling, a lot of people are feeling horrible. And I I honestly think that, at least in the small caps, the market's become so competitive that, like, just every once in a while, it's so much more frequently than in the past. Every once in a while, you're going to just have a day or two or a week where you're just like, is it even possible to win? Or I can't do anything right. And when all those dominoes fall, like, you have to make sure that you're going to be able to survive that and keep trading, because on the other side of that is usually the good times. So,
Yeah.
and it happens very frequently. You just have to be ready for that.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'm curious, for any traders who is listening to us now, regardless of their experience level, what would you shared briefly that formula of 1%. Are there any other specifics that you could just share with them so that they can, regardless of their size, their account size, and or experience level, should use as a metric when it comes to risk R?
Of course. So every strategy, whether you're meticulous or not, you can always pull the information out. So one service that I use, which I'm not sponsored by, is TraderView. And basically you can pull your logs from your broker and just get data. You can, even if it's a couple months old, I've done year-long old uploads. You can get the information that you need and start marking up your trades. Just give them labels, understand what your strategies are, and essentially, like, gather information towards, okay, out of all the stats here, what's my average win? What's my average loss? It's even better if you can make it convert it into R, because obviously on some days you might be risking, $500. One day you're risking $1,000, or 2 weeks from now, $5,000, whatever. But if you can distill it to the average in R, that's a really big deal. And actually, they have a feature where you can put in the dollar amount you were risking on that day, so you can normalize it into R. If you're willing to be meticulous, you don't even have to do the journaling work. All you have to do is just go back and put what you risked. Okay, so once you identified that, depending on how many strategies you have, I'm just going to go over how you do it for one, because how you do it for one is how you do it for all of them.
Perfect.
Essentially, you're looking for the average win, average loss, and win rate. Those three stats determine, like, your expected drawdown. So basically, you can simulate out, like, how many times in the worst case scenario will you probably lose? Can you expect to lose? You can simulate, is the strategy even profitable? And you can also see if there's any way to optimize it. But aside from that, in terms of the risk part, I would be looking towards, okay, let's say on average, you're going to make 2 to 3 times what you risk. Then I would make sure that each and every single day for that strategy, you do not lose more than you expect to gain on average. So I'm going to distill it because usually it's coming out in dollar amounts. But let's just say you have a 2 to 1 or let's say 3 to 1 ratio. It's easier.
Mhm.
If you expect to make 3, you should never lose more than 3 on any given trade.
Mm.
And the reason for that is because once you cross that threshold, now you're just digging yourself in a hole. Whereas if you keep your risk within those limits, the best case scenario is that you don't draw down whatsoever. You make that 3 and you move on. The worst case scenario is that you just lose that 3 and it's recoverable by the same strategy on another day when everything's reset. Like the market's reset, whole new set of names, everything. The second thing is based on the win rate as well, you want to determine what is the actual like expected drawdown. So a lot of simulators, you plug in those 3 numbers, they'll tell you, say, for example, if I'm in some strategy and it just spits out, okay, on this strategy, in the worst case scenario, you can draw down 20%. Okay, so if I'm risking 1% of my account and I can draw down 20%, am I okay with that statistic? You're going to get more information. You're going to see what is the overall equity curve. You're going to see, is it a crappy sideways consolidating curve or is it a parabolic curve that just sometimes has hiccups? Depending on that, you have to understand how much risk you want to apply to that trade. So I'm not saying you have to risk 1%, but at some point there's going to become an uncle number. So let's say, for example, if you double it from 1% where you could have a 20% drawdown and you bring it up to 2%, more than likely that expected drawdown is going to increase by double. So can you afford to lose 40% of your account? I would say if you're losing 40% on a strategy in terms of drawdown, you're risking way too much. There's going to be strategies where you have a very high win rate and you can risk more because it's very infrequent that those drawdowns add up. At the end of the day, what it is like if I flip a coin heads or tails, mathematically there's a number that statistically will happen if you just keep flipping that coin 1,000 times. And what is trading? It's just flipping that coin over and over again. Some of the coins are lopsided, sure, but at the end of the day, that's what tail risk is. That one day you can flip 6 tails in a row. And if you're not prepared for that worst case scenario, then you're screwed. So again, the last thing I would say with that data is, so now you've determined how much you should lose on any position at most. And I wouldn't necessarily keep it at the 3, for example. I might go down to 2 or 2.5 because a lot of times you're going to end up hitting 3 anyway, just through being able to trade another time. But that's more of a nuance. Either way, that's your position loss. And now you have to determine your daily max loss. So now what you have to do is extrapolate the information. So if you have a position loss, let's say just of 3, and you trade 3 tickers with the strategy on average per day, then you should set a lockout for that strategy or just for your account of 3 times 3, which is 9. So you have 3 position loss per ticker and 9 daily max loss. All it is just extrapolating the fundamental R and drawing it out so that every day you can go in and tell your broker, like, this is where I want you to stop me out. This is where I want there to be no more trading. Because as much as people want to believe that they can just trade their way out of any hole, the math suggests very heavily, and I would trust it, that you're not going to make it back. In fact, you're just going to make it harder the next day. So if you're like, oh, I'm at 9%, or I'm at my 9R daily max loss, but I'm going to give it more try. And then next try, you go on tilt or you get slipped or something like this, and you go down to minus 12. Then the next day, all you're doing is just setting yourself back one more trade, one more winning trade that would have pulled you ahead and said, now you're just catching up. And remember, like when you lose in terms of percentages as well, you should be sizing down. So it's going to be way harder to recoup. you're just shooting yourself in the foot, and that's where the ego gets attached. A lot of times in trading, at least in my experience, it's all about knowing when to tap out and just give up, because there are some days that are just unwinnable. And I find that traders blow up every time that they are so convicted or convinced that they've been screwed or scammed, or that they want to just fight the ticker to death. And that's where all the mistakes come from. I can guarantee this is the experience of 99.9% of traders. If you go back on all your trading days and you just look at the biggest loss days, you're going to see most of those losses are a mistake, number one. And number two, entirely avoidable. And number three, probably the vast majority of your P&L loss of the whole career, of your whole career. And if you just add up all those losses minus the one that you expected to take, if you just add up the extra slippage, the extra attempts, everything, it's probably on par with how much you've made your entire career as well.
That's got to be a painful moment when traders see that for themselves. What do you feel you have? How have you resisted that temptation? How have you stayed unattached for yourself?
Well, first, understanding, just really studying it and understanding what it is. It doesn't take long. I think you could really feel like you have a good grasp of it within a week. Of course, there's like extra things they can go into, but at the end of the day, it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
What I would say is like occasionally I'll touch the fire, touch the hot stove, and it'll just remind me then. And I just recognize that thankfully I have like a methodology I can keep going back to. Right? I have a risk management strategy I can keep going back to.
Yeah.
And I think without kind of building that foundation, it would be really easy to lose confidence, because you wouldn't have any idea if that would even work in the first place. Whereas kind of what I suggest to traders is to just keep building out that foundation, spend some time with a certain strategy or certain philosophy of risk, let that play out enough that you gain confidence, so that, okay, now that I'm going to go start expanding my horizons, I'm going to start trying different things. I heard X trader say this or that, and I'm going to try it. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, you need to be able to pivot back to what you've done. So that's the number one thing for traders, is when they don't have that, and a lot of them don't, it's just impossible to find a way out of that, especially emotionally.
Yeah, emotionally, I imagine it's the hardest part. I mean, it's all hard, certainly financially, but that emotion and that feeling beat up, or it's hard not to take it personally, especially if it's something you've created yourself with the choices you've made. It's hard not to find it. I can imagine it's even more difficult to pull yourself back to neutrality, to
No,
correct.
usually you need someone to talk to you. Like
Yeah.
it's something that you shouldn't go through on your own. And that's why it's really important to have friends in trading.
Yeah.
And what I found is that even if you're talking to someone who doesn't really, they don't necessarily need to know everything about your strategy or how you trade.
Yeah.
A lot of times just having a sounding board, like vocalizing your own thoughts and having it reflect back to you, a lot of times that helps solve the problem as well. Because like in a very sinister way, when you're working on your own and you're trying to solve your own issue in this regard, a lot of times you'll convince yourself of the most like heinous kind of ways of managing risk or dealing with the problem, and you'll accept things with flaws, whereas when you're talking to someone, it's just so obvious like that there's an error in the way you're thinking. And that's really what you need, is you need someone to stop you from making these tilted decisions. Kind of just that. And I've done that a lot. And I really encourage people to find one or two people that they can really talk to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's such great advice, because we can't, you know, we can't, one of the phrases in coaching is like we, are when we make mistakes or when we experience suffering of any sort, it doesn't happen in isolation, nor does the healing, nor does the recovery. It can't happen in isolation. And I think, especially because it's majority of men who are trading, I do think there is a little bit of men who have a default because the culture shames them if they don't try to do it themselves and fix it themselves and grind it out themselves. And so that feeling of like shame, if I talk about it to anybody, I think is more heightened in this industry above almost any other industry I've seen.
It is. And ironically, if you display what you're ashamed of, it connects you to people the most. What I noticed, like I have a trading community, and what I encourage people to do is just share your struggles. And I notice the people who constantly putting themselves out there, they have the most opportunities to meet people who can help them with the things that they want to achieve. And like there are people who kind of sit around and keep it to themselves. Even when I try to be an open kind of like forum for them to say, hey, like I need you to send me a message sooner when you're in trouble, not a month later.
Yeah.
And I see that a lot. And pretty much every single time they say, I wish I did it sooner. I wish I sent a message sooner. And I don't know why I didn't. I just felt like no one's going through this. But one thing I try to remind people is like I'm very in tune with how people feel again. So I always bring it up and try to give people an opportunity to speak on what's going on because I know again, if I'm having a crappy time, and I know my friends are having a crappy time, someone is going to be sitting there by themselves who doesn't talk to anyone, and they're going to feel so crappy about themselves, like, why am I not doing this? And they just need to know like somebody else is going through it too, so that they don't throw everything away. Because that, I mean, that's one really, really powerful thing, just being really open. And I think in terms of Twitter, what gets you more benefits in terms of relationships is actually sharing the things that are going wrong versus what's going right. And I think you see mostly what's going right, and that just perpetuates the feeling that you're not doing anything. Whereas if you're sharing what's going wrong, like people are more willing to reach out and help or like connect with you.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much how I started it all as well. Like I started my Twitter feed with 0 followers, and like I didn't do anything to grow it. I just said what's going on, and it just kind of came to like everything kind of came to me. And I think I'm just speaking from that spot because I know a lot of people, they're like, well, I can't, I have nowhere to start. I don't know anybody. Why would anyone care about me? And it's
Mm.
kind of like, no, I know you can do it. And there's even easier ways to do it now because, for example, like I try to help encourage that for people as well and just make sure people are connecting. And so like I just noticed people who connect make the largest strides in trading.
I did a YouTube live last Thursday, and this is a shout out to you, Tina. There's a gal who's come to every one of them that I've done, and I offered for her to come into the room on camera. Unbeknownst to me, Ricky Analog that day was watching, and he hopped in, and she wrote me, a DM over the weekend. She was like, she was nervous. I could tell she was nervous. Ricky could tell she was nervous. It was a very vulnerable thing to share her challenge as a trader. But the DM she sent, like, it makes me cry thinking about it. She was like, that was the single most powerful thing that I have now learned as a trader with the information that Ricky, advised her around. And she, like, I could see how the scariest thing for her was to do that conversation. And now it is the richest reward she's receiving because she has clarity that she didn't have access to before.
Nice. That's great.
It was just such a beautiful example of everything you're saying. Like, come be vulnerable. And now, and of course, what does he say? He's like, my DMs are open to you, Tina, anytime you need. Like, that's what happens when you are honest about the difficulty, about the mistakes you've made, about the challenge you're facing. And that's, I see you do that too. Like you, Ricky, like so many traders, you guys are super busy. And yet I watch all of you. And when do you offer to help somebody? When they have been vulnerable enough to admit the honest truth on that public platform. That's when you guys are like completely, you're there for them. It's amazing to watch, Brian.
Yeah, it is. I really appreciate that about the community. Like most successful traders are very, very nice people and very generous as well with their time. Like you'd be very surprised.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to do an X space now, but if people want to join your Discord community, please tell them where they can go and find it.
Well, you can go to my Twitter and just click through either my website or the pin page. And actually, some people can't find it, even though I make it very easy. So, in a way, if you can't find it, like, don't join. But it's there. It's very easy.
And am I correct that on your YouTube channel, your podcast, you also do a couple of conversations about risk?
I do a lot. Actually, just really quickly, one thing I would say is
Yeah.
in my server, I've pretty much taken all the content that I would have posted on Twitter, unfortunately, and put it in the server just because it's a better means of communication. There's a lot of videos there. What I would recommend for pretty much anyone is just do the free trial for 7 days. It doesn't cost anything. Like literally download all the videos or save the links and just watch it. Like I'm not really gatekeeping that. It's there and it's not on another platform. So you can get a lot of value just by clicking in.
That's fabulous. I'm so glad you said that. And Brian and I are in a conversation about whether it would be a value to put a course together about risk. So if that's something you guys think would be something you'd want, just put it in the comments to wherever you see this podcast to let us know. And then we'll continue the conversation. All right, so we're going to go over to X Space now. And I want to thank Centerpoint for sponsoring this podcast. Thank you all for watching. And we'll see you on the next recording.